Welcome into the install with Greg Cosell of NFL Films. I'm doing a little mobile podcasting on my side of things. Greg is where he always is, locked in the lab, grinding the tape. It's college football time for Greg, but we're going to continue our previews, our divisional previews, after he was kind enough to visit with us last week down in Nashville, taking some Titans OTAs, of which I know you really enjoyed your experience, Greg.
It was so good. I mean, we talked while I was there. Really got a chance to talk to a lot of people. Um, got a chance actually to spend a few minutes with Cam Ward, and I don't know if we talked about that, but you can almost feel how impressive a kid he is. Now, again, we're not sitting here saying he's going to be an All-Pro. That's not my point. We don't know what he's going to be, although I think he's going to be very, very good. I know my good buddy Louis Riddick feels the same way, and we've talked about Cam Ward. He was the one who actually put me onto him because I remember because Louis this past season, the 2024 season, was in our building every week doing Turning Point, and he'd always walk by my office, and I'd say, "Hey, who do you got this week?" And he'd tell me, and I'd said to him, I said, "Hey, have you done Cam Ward?" He said, "Oh yeah, I've done a number of his games," and he said, "You got to watch him." He said, and then he started telling me how special the kid was. So he was the one who initially, said to me, "Hey, you really have to focus your attention on Cam Ward." But just, meeting him for 10 minutes and, just talking to him briefly, obviously not heavy football stuff. I just met him, but you can just kind of feel how impressive he is. Have you had a chance to talk to him at all?
Not one-on-one, just being around him at Combine and then here throughout the course of the offseason. It's been more, generalized press scrums type of things. But
Right, right.
I'll borrow a turn of phrase from Rand Carthon, the former Titans GM, when he was talking about Tajay Spears at the Combine a couple of years ago. He said that guy's just made of the right shit, and that seems to be the case for Cam
Yeah,
Ward, to some degree. What as we always preface these kind of things, what they do around him is going to be almost as important as what he's capable of doing. But
I agree.
in visiting with Lewis this week on the radio show, Greg, and in our conversations between you and I, both on the podcast and off the podcast, it's hard to not feel some level of optimism in his ability to succeed based on how his makeup is.
Right. And again, you were there, so you saw it. But I mean, I love the whole thing with Jeffrey Simmons and Cam Ward, and Big Jeff knows that Cam Ward is the guy that has to take them to the promised land if they're to get there. And, he wants to see what this kid's made of. And, early returns are really positive as far as Cam Ward, being a guy that gave it right back to him and it didn't affect how he played through the minicamp.
Yeah, God knows Denver is going to be doing the exact same thing in week one. So as ready as he can be for that moment is
Yeah.
going to benefit the Titans in the short and long term. Today, though, we're going to take a look at the NFC North, which is a fascinating division unto itself. Two 14-win teams in that
Yeah.
division last year, and the Packers were no slouch either. I mean, hell, the Bears. If not for the confusing coach situation and then the offensive line, there was a lot to like about Caleb Williams when he was allowed to play within structure, when he was able to play within structure, Greg. It's just a lot of times it felt like he was throwing his hands up in the air and just trying to make something happen based on their
Well,
roster construction.
I think the Ben Johnson hire is going to be a great, great thing for Caleb Williams because one thing I've learned about Ben Johnson and speaking to people is there's no BS with him. He is so detail oriented that, he's the kind of guy that if a receiver lines up half a yard wrong, he gets on him. So, and from what I understand, he is coaching Caleb Williams very, very hard. But you have to understand, not you, but people have to understand, and this is not just specific to Caleb Williams, Buck. This is specific to most quarterbacks, almost all quarterbacks coming out of college. Number one, they're not really taught defenses. Number two, they're not really given two or three plays in a huddle. They don't even huddle. So now we're talking about just the operational part of being in a huddle with, let's say, two play calls coming to the line of scrimmage, ideally with 12 or 13 seconds left on the play clock, so they can see what the defense looks like and then be able to call the right play. Whether, we've heard from watching games on TV, kill, kill, kill so many times, or whatever words teams use. these are things that quarterbacks coming out of college have no understanding of whatsoever, and neither did Caleb Williams. And like I said, this is not a personal knock on Caleb Williams. These are things you have to learn. And Ben Johnson is a stickler for the two-play concept, and then having your quarterback. Now, obviously, he had Jared Goff, who's a veteran quarterback who understands all this because it's been through the league. But this is where he wants Caleb Williams to get to, and those things do take some time.
Yeah, and I mean, all four of these teams are fascinating for different reasons, Greg, but Chicago may be the most interesting to me, not just because of the Ben Johnson addition, but they're clearly valuing or putting a premium on getting him offensive line help to make sure that he can
Oh
succeed
yeah.
in as many ways as possible, right? They acquired Joe Thuney from the Chiefs. They signed Drew Dalman from the Falcons. They traded for Jonah Jackson from the Rams. They've obviously got Darnell Wright, the first round pick out of Tennessee a couple of years ago, and then Braxton Jones is their left tackle for the time being. We'll see how that situation plays out. They do have a second round pick on the roster, Ozzie Trapilo, if I'm pronouncing
Yeah, a
that
player
name.
I really like out of BC. Has experience at right and left tackle, and he's a good prospect.
So that to me, combined with Ben Johnson and the fact that it's just, their draft felt like they were playing Madden to a degree, right? With all the skill position players
Yeah.
that they're adding. It's no small feat. I wonder, Greg, as you look at, Minnesota obviously making a quarterback change, moving on from Sam Darnold and going with JJ McCarthy here, at least in the immediate. You have Green Bay, who had some injury setbacks last year, but expects to be right in the mix. And then Detroit with their first real iteration of brain drain from a coaching standpoint, losing
Yeah.
both of their coordinators to a fellow division, or one coordinator certainly to a fellow divisional rival as a head coach. I wonder which team, Greg, you are most interested in seeing, even though they all have unique storylines and are all very interesting for different reasons here.
Well, I'm sure I'm not the only one, Buck, but I'm very interested to see JJ McCarthy. Kevin O'Connell is one of the best quarterback coaches in the game. He really understands how to get quarterbacks comfortable within the context of an offense. He teaches fundamentals and mechanics. I noticed that right away last year in just the only preseason game that JJ McCarthy played before he was shelved for the season, that his footwork on his drop and set in the pocket was 1,000% better than it was at the University of Michigan. And that's all Kevin O'Connell working with him. I actually spoke to Kevin about that last offseason, and we talked about that. And, he indicated that was a focus of what he was going to do, because that was one thing that concerned me watching JJ McCarthy's tape. I don't think people have an issue with JJ McCarthy's talent level. There were just some things mechanically that were problematic. He didn't time things up really well with his receivers at times. These are things that, theoretically can be worked out, but then the player has to do it. And JJ McCarthy did it. And he's a talented kid. So I would expect he'll have success. We don't know, Buck, what level of success. We can't sit here and say that in mid-June, what that's going to be. But I expect him to play well. And obviously, I think their offense will be a solid offense. Defensively, they're always fun. At times, they give up big plays because of Brian Flores, very aggressive. I don't know if you can hear me, but you froze.
Sorry about that, Greg. That was on my end. Yes, I
Yeah.
did hear you. It was just a
Okay.
quick
So
freeze
we
on
can
my
just
end.
pick up. So we can just pick up. Yeah.
Yeah. So with Minnesota certainly having a lot of those interesting questions around them, as you mentioned, I think Green Bay is almost as interesting, just because there's such I wouldn't say it's a small sample size of Jordan Love at this point in his career, Greg, but it's a lot of expectations on him and
Yeah.
them in a division that is chock full of talent. It was like a celebration in Green Bay this year at the draft because they took a first round wide receiver for the first time in God knows how long in Matthew Golden. But with all the different pieces and parts and knowing what you know about Matt LaFleur's system and what he comes from beyond just what wrinkles he's able to add to the personnel, what's the most interesting thing about the Packers at this point?
Well, everybody will focus on Love. It'll be his third year as a starter. His second year was up and down, which didn't surprise me at all, just because teams play him differently, show him different things, and that's then you have to work through all that. But he's an extremely talented kid. I don't think he's an issue for their offense. What we know about Matt LaFleur is he really does want to run the ball. I mean, Josh Jacobs had close to 300 carries, and I think that's the way he wants to play. I think that's one reason they signed Aaron Banks from the 49ers to play left guard. He's a big kid. He's a road grader. He wants to run the football as the foundation of his offense. Defensively, I think where the biggest concern for them is defensively is going to be on the back end. They don't really have true outside corners. People probably are aware that Jerry Alexander signed with the Ravens. They made a decision not to bring him back, but they don't really have a true outside corner. Keyshawn Nixon moved out there last year out of necessity due to injury, and he will probably play outside, but he's really a slot. So is Nate Hobbs, who they signed from Las Vegas. He may have to play on the outside, but he's really a slot. So they have all these slot receivers, but two of them are going to have to play on the outside. So that would be, to me, as we sit here now in June, that would be an area of concern for this Packers defense. Now, Jeff Hafley does a great job with defensively. He'll figure out how to at least minimize it until he can get that all kind of worked through. And I think that will take some time early in the season. But I think they've got a really good front group, and hopefully that can take some of the pressure off the back end.
Yeah, listeners of this podcast will be well aware that Greg has been carrying me on the X's and O's analysis for this past 5 years. But just, Greg, from the untrained eye, I so enjoy watching Jeff Hafley's defense and knowing what he was at Boston College,
Yeah.
in the collegiate ranks, coming up and seeing the way that he was able to maximize the talent of the players. A very aggressive scheme, certainly, and that
Yes.
they will have to account for that given what their secondary currently looks like, which I'm not telling them any secrets, right?
Oh, and of course, there's a lot of pressure schemes that don't necessarily compromise or sacrifice coverage. Everybody thinks pressure automatically. Oh my God, you're playing man, you're going to get beat. We know that that's not true. So there are many pressure schemes. Steve Spagnuolo is a master of it, where you can play sort of zone concepts behind really cool pressures. So Jeff Hafley will do a lot of that, so he doesn't leave these corners in pure man-to-man coverage. Now that'll happen sometimes, obviously, but he's pretty creative with his pressure concept. We actually saw that at BC. We'll see that, we saw it last year with Green Bay, and he's got some really good players. Quay Walker can get to the quarterback. Edgerrin Cooper is an excellent blitzer. He'll now that he's in his second year, he's an explosive athlete. Devontae Wyatt, a D tackle, started to come on last year. As I guess it was his third year coming out of Georgia. He's starting to play well. So they've got a lot of pieces in their front group.
We'll wrap up with the fourth team in this division, not fourth by any metrics of standing, but just in the order that we got to them today. We mentioned the Detroit Lions and the coaching changes that they'll have. Out goes Ben Johnson in particular, and John Morton will take over as the
Yeah,
OC there. They also lose their longtime center, Greg, which I think is no small thing in the middle of this as they continue to adjust to the changes that, the NFL, once you start to have success, people start to pick you off that way. And they're having Tate Ratledge, the second round pick, it sounds like, rep the majority at center at this point. I assume you did him coming out of
it is.
college.
And that'll be interesting because they also have Graham Glasgow, and maybe they don't want to move him from right guard and keep that the same. But he has experience at center, so I think through training camp we'll see, because Ratledge played guard at Georgia, not center.
Right.
So we'll see how that plays out between Ratledge and Glasgow as they go through training camp. But I think the coordinator issue, to me, I would imagine structurally and conceptually, the offense and the defense will look the same. I think the issue the issue. I don't want to say an issue as if it's a negative. What will be different, let's put it that way, is how they go through a game and call a game. But I think, how they put in the defense, how they put in the offense, I don't think you'll see dramatic changes because they've been successful. Certainly on offense, they've been extremely successful. Defensively, they've got some new pieces defensively. And I think they made some some good moves, but I think it will be how games are called. And that's a hard thing to know because you almost have to be there during the week to know how they go through the process. But I think that's where there could be changes in what they do because it's different. Ben Johnson called a game, Aaron Glenn called a game. We don't know if Johnny Morton and Kelvin Shepard, we don't know how they see a game as it plays out because much of that you can plan for that, but you know how coaches are as a game progresses. There's a feel element as well. They get different coaches telling them things that are happening on the field, and then there's a certain feel to how they go about calling a game.
Oh yeah, just to relate that back locally. I mean, Brian Callahan and Denard Wilson have both talked about that here in Tennessee several times over and adjusting to, not Callahan has been involved in play call. Denard Wilson hasn't been involved in the calling of plays, but when the onus is ultimately on you and you're the one pulling the trigger and
Yeah.
then you have to adjust to the personnel and the personnel has to adjust to you, there is a learning curve that people, whether it's Madden or something else that just makes them assume that these things are pretty turnkey. That's simply not the case. And you ultimately
No,
end up learning more about coaches' tendencies this way.
Yeah, and a lot of teams do things with their first 15 plays to get a feel for how a defense responds. You use a certain motion. How does the defense respond? You line up in a certain personnel package in a certain formation. How does the defense respond? And then different coaches then respond to what they see differently. So those are the kinds of things that would be different. And we don't know the answers to that right now. But I think structurally, I mean, the Lions are not going to change their offense structurally. They've got essentially the same group except for that center position potentially. Otherwise, everybody's the same. So they're not really going to change. And by the way, Jared Goff, I'm sure at this point in his career, is probably a meaningful part of this whole process with Johnny Morton because he's been there and he knows the offense like the back of his hand. So, I'm sure he's actively involved in how they go about doing things.
Yeah, and I think that's an important note because I think whether fair or unfair, and these things change as a player progresses through his career. I think Jared Goff has been one of these guys who a lot of people associate. Okay, Sean McVay is the reason that Jared Goff is having success, or Ben Johnson is the reason that Jared Goff is having success. This is a number one overall pick who's clearly got talent and the intelligence to last in the league. I think far too often that fans tend to chalk these things up to, oh, well, he's a product of the system when the system and the player are supposed to work in concert together.
Well, and the other thing too is I know quite a bit about Ben Johnson's offense and how he teaches it. And Jared Goff has to have a high level of football intelligence in order to do this. So there's no, could there be a learning curve just because, hey, he's going to hear a different voice in his ear. He's going to hear perhaps different play calls in situations where maybe he would expect something a little different from Ben Johnson. So there's going to be a learning curve. But Jared Goff's played a lot of football in this league, and he's not really going to be surprised by anything.
No, absolutely right. I'm looking forward to getting into the AFC West with you next week, Greg. I'm certainly looking forward to seeing how the NFC North plays out. There's a lot of fascinating, I mean, each and every year there's fascinating
Oh,
divisions in the
I mean,
NFL,
and
but
fuck, can you believe we're getting close already? It's June 20th.
buddy, don't rush me through my 6 weeks. I know you don't take
I know.
vacation, but I got to have a little time to breathe before training camp hits me in the chest. I need it.
You need a little time before you're out there doing the show in 100-degree heat.
Well, it's not digging ditches for a living, but training camp comes
No.
for us all. You missed the 97-degree weather that we are currently experiencing here.
Oh,
And
well, hey, it's supposed to be 100 degrees here in South Jersey for like 2, 3 days this coming week.
well, maybe I'll be happy to be in 97-degree heat if it's
Yeah,
100
correct.
degrees in New
Yeah.
Jersey. God knows. Well, Greg, I'll let you get back to the college grind. I'll look forward to catching up with you again next week, my brother, and thank you as always for doing this.
Thanks, Buck. Appreciate it.